Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build this late production M3 Lee. This is a 1/35th scale kit by Takom. I've never built a Takom kit before, but they've been recommended by a few people and the price was pretty decent, so I figured why not give it a go, and I am pretty excited to build this. The back of the box shows us nothing. There's so much space here for artwork, just wasted. Oh well. The sides of the box show us some information including an image of everything that comes inside the box, and some images of the other kits that Takom offer based on the M3 hull. The other side has a very basic painting guide that suggests using ammo by MIG colours. Inside the box we find quite a lot of stuff, a bit too much stuff to give everything a detailed look, at least not without adding another 20 minutes to the video. I'm not sure exactly how many parts there are, but there are quite a lot. I was told that Takom make very high quality models, and looking at these sprues I am inclined to agree. They're very crisply and neatly moulded and there's quite a lot of detail there. This is a fairly new tooling, 2017 according to Scalemates, so that's probably the reason this is so nice. I'm used to being disappointed by older kits that have a ton of flash and mould lines, so this is a very welcome change. Mould lines are of course present, as they always are, but they're for the most part quite minor on this kit and should barely take any effort to clean up. I tried, but I couldn't find any obvious defects on any of the sprues. I rather like that the tracks in this kit are link and length, rather than the dreaded rubber band tracks. I do have one complaint there though, there is only one jig for one section of track. It would be much better if there was a jig for all of the curved sections of track, but we'll talk more about the track later. There's quite a lot to like here. There's a lot of rivets and bolts and stuff that I think will make the model fun to paint when it's done. I like that some parts have casting detail on them to represent cast parts, which is nice. Also, if you look closely, there are raised numbers and letters to represent part numbers or whatever they are that would be cast or welded into the parts. Very interesting. Also, there's some clear plastic lenses for the headlamps, which is also a nice touch. Obviously the plastic parts aren't the only thing in the box, you also get some decals. These look pretty decent. There's a few different marking choices here, including German ones, so if you want to, you could build this as a captured vehicle. There's also some photo-etched parts. Some of these things are incredibly tiny and probably very fiddly. They're cool to have though. The good news is there's a jig to help you bend the brush guards into shape. And of course there's an instruction booklet. I imagine this would be quite the nightmare to try and build with no instructions. The booklet is quite well laid out and the instructions are for the most part fairly simple and easily understood and followed. Towards the back of the booklet there are some simple painting guides, though I would really consider them more of a suggestion than a guide. They could be helpful for somebody though. There's also a picture of this M31 kit, which looks really interesting and I'm definitely considering getting that. Enough rambling, let's build this. The instructions say to start with the hull bottom, so I'll comply. For now. The first thing to do is drill out these 3 holes in the bottom of the hull. The instructions weren't immediately clear that they want you to drill the hull. The image is a bit cut down, but I did figure it out quickly enough. This is of course quite easy to do. I'm sure I don't need to demonstrate how to use a pin vise to drill a hole. The holes needed to be drilled so that we can add this plate. I'm not sure what it's for or why it needs to be a separate part. Maybe the other variants of the Lee don't have this, or maybe it's just for fun. Whatever the reason, it's not hard to install. I add a tiny bit of extra glue around the edges just to make sure that it's bonded nicely. Next, it's time to attach the hull rear. This is rather easy to position. It doesn't quite lock in, but you'll know when you've got it right. I add a bit of glue on the inside again just to make sure there's a good solid bond. Moving to the front of the hull, I attach the transmission casing part. The fit here is quite nice. There are gaps, but they look more like joints between the different panels than gaps, which I guess is still kind of a gap, but not the bad kind. Then I install the final drive casings. I wasn't 100% sure if I was putting these on the right way up, but they look okay to me. There is a bit of a gap around them that shouldn't be there. Looking at pictures of Lee's, that area is pretty smooth. It should be easy enough to fill that in, but I won't be doing that during this video. Then comes the outward-facing part of the final drives. There's keying on these parts to help get them lined up nicely, though there is a tiny bit of play there, so I eyeball it and try and get it as centered as I can. The right side one was a little bit tighter to get into place. I took care of that by applying a bit of extra pressure. Then it's time to turn these 2 parts into the axle things for the idler wheels. This is fairly simple, though they did end up having quite a bit of a gap along the bottom. This should be fine, that probably won't be seen anyway. Those assemblies can then be fitted into the little rectangular protrusions on the back of the hull like so. The gappy part of the axle assembly should face downward. They will stay there with friction, but it's almost definitely a better idea to glue them into place. I built these assemblies one after the other rather than simultaneously to avoid getting the parts mixed up. Now it's time for sprockets, wheels, and other rolly bits. First, the sprockets. These are comprised of two simple parts that very easily lock together like so. Nothing tricky here at all. Then come the idler wheels. These are the most complex idler wheel I've ever built, mostly because they're usually just one piece. First, I glue the hub into the center. It has a couple of guide pins, but I found it a little bit fiddly to get it seated properly. Then there's a couple of rings that should be glued inside the rim of the wheel. This is pretty easy really, though I did break one of the rings while trying to clean it up, but I was still able to glue it into place neatly enough. There is a slight gap around the rim here. I'll have to fill that in if I decide that it's too noticeable. Next, the road wheels. This involves gluing the back part into the main wheel. The part is keyed so that you don't get it on backwards, but my issue is that these are a bit too tight. I had to apply quite a bit of force to get the parts to go together, and I wasn't sure if I'd got the back part all the way in. But that's where it seems to want to stay, so I leave it and hope it's going to work. Eventually, we end up with this delightful pile of wheels. Some a bit more spiky than others, but all of them are really good. Now it's time to make bogies, starting with these 4 pieces. Building the bogies might seem a little bit complicated, but it's pretty simple when you break it down into smaller steps. As you can see, I first glue this angled part to the flat part that will join onto the hull. Then there's a pair of slightly triangle-y side parts that go on like so. There's keying on these to help you get them lined up nice and straight. The instructions say to make 6 of these, and who am I to disagree? Here's the parts for the next step. First, you put the arm things onto the springs part. The arms have a slight curve on one side, and that should go in towards the springs. I don't put any glue on these parts because that would almost definitely cause fitting issues later. The part more or less clips into place on the first assembly I made. I then add glue and place the return roller. I take the outer bogey part, which was mislabeled in the instructions as part B3, even though there isn't a B sprue. You should be able to figure out which part you should use here anyway. Sandwich the return roller between it and the inner half of the bogey. This is admittedly kind of fiddly, but it's not all that hard to do, and you end up with 6 of these delightful bogies. All of the arms that hang down from them should be free moving. Now it's wheel time. We need to attach the road wheels to these arm things, whatever you might call them. This is pretty easy. Put the appropriate axle part through the wheel, then glue the other bar part on. Of course, make sure that you're using the correct parts and that all the little flat parts are on the same side as each other. There are 6 like these, and another 6 that look like this. They do look very similar, and they are, but there are subtle differences, so make sure that you don't get the parts mixed up. There should be one of each arm and wheel set on each bogey. Then they can kind of clip onto the bogey assembly like so, and they should stay there without any glue. I've put these on with the axle bolts on the road wheels not having any holes on the outside. The inner facing side has holes in the center of those bolts. As you can see, the arms in the bogies that were left free now rest atop the flat part on the wheel support arm, whatever you call it. Hopefully you can see why gluing that into place would have been a bad idea. You can tell I had a lot of fun with this part after it was built. I am an easily amused child. Obviously I made 6 of these, 3 for each side of the tank. These were fiddly and they did take a fair bit of time to build. But the detail is pretty good and they can be left to move and be positioned fairly realistically if you're going to use aftermarket tracks. Unsurprisingly, these bogies can then be glued to the sides of the hull. There are recesses for them to mount into, which makes it very easy, and it looks pretty good. I then glue the idler wheel on. I don't think this really needs to be left to rotate. The tracks should be able to slide over it easily enough if you're using aftermarket ones, and it shouldn't make a difference if you're using the included tracks. Then the drive sprocket. I left this loose. When installing the tracks, it will probably be useful to have this able to rotate. Speaking of tracks, they're the next step. Initially I thought these would be pretty good. I'm not going to be using them, but I will quickly show a bit of my attempt at assembling them. There is one jig for the tracks. This is to help you get the slight curve up from the return rollers onto the drive sprocket. The long track part links in here like so, with the open end towards the front of the jig. Then add 6 individual links. This is pretty simple. You can either add glue on the inside of the joints as you add each link, or just put them all into place and then add glue, letting it seep in between the joints. Just don't glue the tracks to the jig. That would kind of hinder putting them onto the tank. As you can see, this is only a very slight curve, but it is nice that they provide a jig to help with it. It would have been even nicer if they provided jigs for the rest of the curved sections of track. But maybe they expect you to glue them onto the model as you go. I wanted them to be removable, so I wasn't doing that. Thanks to editing, I don't have to show you how much I messed up trying to put these tracks together using the drive sprocket and idler wheel as a kind of jig, without also gluing the tracks to the tank. But I will say that it was quite fiddly and rather annoying, and my notes include a lot of swearing at this point. I wanted to get at least one run of the tracks finished, so that I could show you how the tank might look with the included tracks completed and on the model, while still giving myself the option to replace them later with aftermarket tracks. And I did get them together reasonably neatly, and in 2 sections so that they would be removable. But as you might be able to see, the tracks are too short. I don't think I could force them together without causing some damage, so I didn't bother building the second set of tracks. After all that effort, this really annoyed me. I didn't stab anything with my sprue cutters, but I did rage order a set of Frual metal tracks. They didn't arrive in time for this video, because Hungary is very far away. Moving on, I attached this fender support thing. Whatever it is, it sits on top of the final drive casing here like so. I didn't really film this very well, but you can see the keying into which this fender or mudguard part or whatever you'd call it will join. This is slightly fiddly, but it goes into place easily enough. A similar process happens on the right side of the tank, just the parts are a little bit different. This ended up looking pretty neat. The trick here is getting the support parts nice and straight on top of the final drive casings. Next, I add some hull side plates. First, the left side. These parts are shaped such that they link together very nicely. Rather than them just butting up against the other parts, there's an angle moulded into them, so you should be able to form nice straight corners with minimal gaps. I apply a little extra glue to the inside to ensure a good strong bond. To save repetition, I do this on a lot of joins. The right side is just as easy to get into place as the left. I really like it when parts are made like this. Makes everything go together so easily. Then I make 2 of these little hatches. I guess they're vision ports? I don't think they're for ingress or egress. I don't think a man could fit through these. Whatever they are, the instructions say to make these with 2 parts, one being the internal detail. I didn't realise this at the time, but unless you're modelling these open, you don't really need the inner part, so you might as well save a fraction of a second and omit this part if you're going to be modelling them closed like I will be. Then I take these 2 things and glue them together. The fit looks a little bit odd, with the grill part standing proud of the boxy part, but that's how it should be. I set that aside for now and I move on to the front of the hull, where I attach these towing or lifting lugs. These are pretty easy to attach, though do be careful to get them the right way up. I can imagine it wouldn't be too hard to put them on upside down. I figure it would be neater to sit them loosely in place and then add glue, and then nudge the part into place with my knife. Pretty easy. There's one of these on either side, obviously, and they look pretty neat, though it might be worth filling in the slight gap around them. I then clip the shackles on like so. The tweezers make this really easy. You could of course leave these to dangle free, and they would likely stay on, but I've glued them on anyway, just to be sure. Then I add these, I guess you might call them ribs. They go on the front of the transmission casing like so. They fit very neatly into the slots there, and as you can see, I added glue from the inside. The sharper part of the rib should face upwards towards where the upper front plate will be. There is a line on these and it looks a little bit like a mold line, but I'm pretty sure that it should be there, so I don't remove it. Then I glue the vision hatch thing that I made before into this side of the tank. Like I said before, I'm modelling this closed, so it didn't really need the inner half of the hatch, but it's there now. Then it's time to attach this plate here. Is it a floor or a roof? Who knows? The back corner where it joins the hull side is a good guide for this part and it makes it fairly easy to attach. Right up against this comes another armour plate, only this one is much more triangle-y and stands vertically. There is a tab to help with this, but I wasn't sure it was positioned quite right. Fortunately, because at this point it's only joined on one edge, there should be a little bit of flex to allow for minor corrections later if needed. Then on the whole rear, I glue in this assembly that I made earlier. The fit does look a little bit weird, but I'm sure this is fine. Now it's time to add some details to this piece of armor plate. I add another one of the vision hatches that I put together earlier, and again, because I'm modelling it closed, there's no actual need for the rear part of this, but it's on there, so whatever. Now to add some teeny tiny mounting brackets for some tools. Tweezers make adding these a bit easier. I still nudge them with my fat fingers though. It's kind of hard to see where the tiny mounting bumps go, but I managed to get them into place properly anyway. Or at least what looks like properly. Then I assembled a set of tools that go on those brackets. There's not much to this, we just have to glue this whatever it is into the mounting hole on the shovel. I wasn't sure I'd got it positioned exactly right, but it does look close enough for me. Next it's time for some drilling. This frontal plate part needs 4 holes to be drilled in it. It looks like there are recesses for 5 holes, but that's not the case. There are 4 holes. I then glue this plate into the appropriate location at the front of the hull. It should quite easily tuck under the ends of the ribby parts on the transmission casing. This was pretty easy to put on, and the gap where it joins the triangle-y part isn't too bad at all. I then add this oddly shaped piece of armour. This was a little bit harder to attach without gaps. The gap is mainly along the join on the left side of the hull. I'm sure it won't be too hard to fix, but maybe we could explain that away as gaps because the tank is riveted instead of welded. Filling might be better. Either way, I keep moving along and add the uppermost piece of frontal armour. This is pretty easy to get into place, it just needs a little bit of gap minimizing pressure. The result isn't too bad. I then add the tools. It's pretty easy to put these onto the little brackets. I'm not sure there's an exact position for these, there is a fair bit of play in the parts, but I think where I put them looks fine. Next, I add some slightly fiddly details. First, this bracket thing. I'm pretty sure I got this in the right spot, in front of the slightly raised part, and tweezers were pretty helpful here. Then it's time for a pickaxe head. There are guide pins and holes for this which make it very easy to get into place. The next thing is what I think is a siren. This is made up of 2 parts. The front dome-shaped bit is keyed so that it only goes on one way, so joining these 2 parts isn't too hard. Gluing it into place isn't too hard either. The instructions are fairly clear where it belongs. Very good. I bet it makes an annoying sound. Now for this lamp. This is really small, and I got very lucky with this part in that I dropped it twice and found it twice, which is quite amazing. It's really easy to get this part to go flying out of a pair of tweezers. It goes into place on top of the rectangular mount here. I nudge it around until it's sitting nice and straight. Then I add this much bigger headlamp. This one is a lot easier to install owing to its size. There are transparent lenses that are supposed to sit inside these lamp housings, but I think it makes a lot of sense to leave those off until after the model is painted. So I'm going to leave those in the box so that I don't lose them, and you'll just have to imagine what these lamps look like with the lenses installed. Or wait until the painting video in about 20 years. Now it's time to do some work on the roof. Before anything else, a few holes are going to need to be drilled into this part. Not all the recesses on the back of this part need to be drilled, so do pay attention to the instructions. Next comes the hatch that goes above the gun area. This is not hard to install at all. I apply glue from behind just to try and minimize messiness. After that, I apply these rib support things. I don't know what they're called, but I do know that they go into place in these little channels very easily. Of course, adding the long one first is the best way to do this. It'll provide a kind of guide for the shorter part. Next, there's this sort of odd part. What makes it odd is that you're supposed to bend it to fit around the edges of the roof part. This isn't really hard to do at all. Attach the center part first. There's convenient keying so that you don't attach it too far to one side and ruin the model. I would suggest leaving it at this point long enough for the glue to bond properly. Then you simply bend one of the other ends into shape against the roof part. Add glue and pressure and it should stay there with no issues, though I did accidentally make a little bit of a mess with the glue here. It's pretty minor anyway. The same process can then be applied at the other end. I think this is a bit unusual, not that I'm complaining. It's probably a lot neater and easier than it would have been if it were made up of 3 individual parts. I then glue on the vision hatch. This one doesn't have the interior part because, as with before, I'm building it closed. Now it's time to make some more sub-assemblies. First, I join these 2 round boys together. This is clearly very simple to do. At this point the instructions say to make 2 of them, but you will need a third later, so in hindsight I would suggest making 3. Next, this simple box. Like the ventilators I just made, these are very simple. Just glue the lid onto the box. I don't know what more I can say. There's keying to line everything up nicely, and you should make 2 of them. Then an antenna mount. The antenna part has tabs that link into some guides inside the cup-shaped part. The antenna should have a slight tilt to it. After that I make a vision device, which I assume is for the gunner. You might find tweezers helpful with the actual vision device part. The fit is a bit tight, and I don't think I could get that into place with my fat fingers. Then over the top of that comes a protective bar, or whatever you might call it. It's not especially complicated to do, but it does look pretty good. This part will mount above the gun, which is why I'm assuming it's for the gunner. I mean, who else is it gonna be for? Next, I make the main gun. This is keyed, though I don't think it really needs to be. I position it so that it's as straight and neat as I can get it. The gun part itself is nicely moulded and looks pretty good. Then I attach these holders, trunnions, whatever you call them. If you want your gun to elevate and depress, you should leave these unglued. I'm also going to leave them unglued. If I add glue to them now, they probably won't line up correctly with this next part, which I guess you might call the gun mantlet, or gun shield. Whatever it is, you slide the gun in through it and it joins onto the back like so. Because the mounting parts are loose, they can freely move into the correct position. I then add glue and move the gun so that it's at the elevation I want it to be at. Very simple stuff really. The gun assembly can then be glued into the roof part like so. Obviously if you want your gun to traverse you won't glue it in, but I think that would be a lot more fiddly to do. There's a few linkage pieces that you would also need to install to connect the gun vision device so that everything moves all together. I'm fine with the gun being fixed in place, so I'm not going to worry about any of that. Next, I glue on the outer gun casing part. You can see this part has some casting detail moulded into it. At first, I only glue one edge to allow for a little bit of flexibility and fitting. I try to minimize the gap where it joins the side of the hull as best I can. Then I nudge it into place on the inner side, add glue, and it's fairly neatly in place. It's then time to attach the roof assembly to the hull. This isn't too hard, but after test fitting, I determined that it wouldn't just drop into place seamlessly, so I glue one edge at a time, starting with the tank's right side. I slowly work my way around the tank, gluing and applying pressure, trying to minimize the gaps as much as I can. It's not perfect, but I did manage to get it to look fairly nice most of the way around. Unfortunately, there's one fairly obvious spot where I nicked the edge of the armor plate with my knife, which resulted in a bit of a gap, but that can be fixed easily enough. I then add 2 of these round boys, or ventilators if you would prefer. These are pretty easy to install. One goes at the front left here, and the other one goes towards the rear right behind the hatch. Then, one of the boxes I made earlier goes here at the top of the hull above the driver's vision hatch, and the other one goes on the front plate below that hatch. I'm not sure what these are for. Maybe it's ammo, or maybe it's just snacks for the crew. Either way, they're very boxy. The antenna mount then goes into place very easily on the left rear of the fighting compartment, near where the turret will go. I follow that by installing the gunner's sight above the gun. I try to line this up so that it looks like it's matching with where the gun is pointing. Obviously determining that would have been easier with those linkages I mentioned earlier, but I think I managed to get it close enough anyway. Only a rivet counter is going to have a real problem with it anyway. Then I install some more headlamps. These are pretty much the same as the ones on the right really, the tiny little one which I managed to not drop at all this time, and the bigger one into which the clear plastic lens will go. I guess I could have put these on at the same time as the other lights, but it just didn't occur to me. Oh well. After that, I assemble this hatch for the front of the hull. I wasn't 100% sure I was putting this vision device thing in the right way around, but it looks fine to me. I then glue that hatch into the obvious location on the front of the hull. This would look pretty cool if it was modelled open with a driver on the inside, but I've obviously modelled it closed. The kit comes with no crew figures anyway. Now, let's have a look at some of that photo etch. There's a convenient jig to help bend these brush guards into the correct shape. First, bend the ends of those to a 90-degree angle. This should help you get the main bend in the right place. Then, bend the rest of the piece of brass. This isn't too hard to do at all, though I would certainly suggest taking your time with it to avoid messing up. You might find it needs a little bit of an extra bend once it's off the jig just to make sure it's all straight and neat. I then glue these into place over the lights, of course using superglue because these are metal parts and plastic cement won't work on them. I find it kind of funny that the icon in the instructions for superglue is a broken heart. These were a little bit fiddly to get into place, the one on the left being a bit more fiddly than the one on the right, which resulted in a little bit more superglue being spilled there than I would like, but I'm pretty sure I could hide that when I paint the tank anyway. Now it's time for some more drilling, this time on the engine deck. There are several holes to drill here, and in a few different sizes. This is a little bit annoying, but it is easy enough to deal with. After that, it's time to make some boxes for the sides of the hull. As you can see here, the main part of this box is a bit warped, which isn't great, but I'm sure gluing the sides on will take care of that. This part needed a couple of holes drilled, which is easy enough. I then glue the sides on, starting with the larger outer side. This does take care of the warping almost completely. I just needed to apply pressure for a slightly longer duration than usual. Then the smaller side of the box goes on. This is pretty much the same as the other side. On top of this box I glue this handily crank thing. It mounts easily into the holes I drilled earlier. This looks very neat, but I'm not sure what it is. Is it the crank to start the tank? Seems like an odd place to keep it, but it does look neat and I suppose that's what counts. The other box for the other side of the hull goes together pretty much exactly the same way, just it wasn't as warped, which is nice. Another tool is glued on top of this box. I think this is a wrench for adjusting the track tension. Then I attach the engine deck to the hull. I just glue it into place here like so, and the fit is pretty good. The instructions seem to want me to add all of the details and the side parts to this first, and then glue it down, but I feel like adding the engine deck now might be a less fiddly way to do things. The two side parts of the engine deck are also very easy to get into place. There's some tiny gaps there, but they're not too bad, and should be quite easy to fix. I then add the armoured covers for the fuel and I guess maybe other fluid filling points. These parts are not identical, so I only add the same parts at the same time, just to avoid mix-ups. These are pretty simple to attach, just refer to the instructions to determine which side the little lever parts should be on. I sit them in place and then I add glue. The first two were the same part number. Once they're on, I add another 3, which are slightly different, mainly in that the lever is on the other side. Again, check the instructions to figure out the correct placement of these levers, or you could just follow my example. I'm pretty sure I got it right. Once those are all on, it's time to add some tools to the engine deck, like this bar, or is it a handle? Whatever it is, it goes into place very easily here. Then comes another bar. This one goes onto the right side of the tank like so. This one looks much more like a handle. Is it for the pickaxe that I mounted on the front right earlier? Next comes an axe for when the crew need to axe a question. Like all of the other tools, this is very easy to install. Then I add a shovel, for when the crew needs to shovel a question. I'm so funny. Next, I add the stowage boxes. There are some small guide parts on the hull plates here to assist with the positioning of these boxes, and they go on quite easily, though the fit isn't super tight. I apply pressure to minimize the gaps as best I can, but having some gap there is probably fine. They should look like they're added on and not part of the actual hull anyway. Now it's time for some more photo etch. First, the grill on the engine deck. Of course, it's a good idea to hold the part in place while you're cutting it from the fret so that it doesn't fly away. And of course use superglue so that it stays where you put it. It fits neatly enough, though maybe a little bit tight. That's okay, it looks good anyway. There's also some optional very tiny parts. There are 4 of these and I lost one, which is really annoying. I installed 2 of them on either side of the photo-etched grill, which was quite fiddly. I don't know why these details can't be moulded into the plastic, but oh well. It's then time to add the towing cable. There's not a whole lot to this. I just add a bit of glue to each of the 4 mounting points on this and it looks very cable-y. Then I add the rear mud guards. I wasn't sure if I was putting these on quite right. There is a guide tab for them, but there's quite a bit of play in it. I think they look right enough though. Surely these would get knocked around and bent out of place through normal use anyway, so I'm not sure they need to be absolutely perfect. Now it's time to assemble the exhaust pipes. As you can see, these have a D-shaped keying, so it's pretty hard to get this wrong. I make 2 of them, because that's what the instructions said. Then there's some more D-shaped keying on the hull to guide the positioning of those exhaust pipes. They should both be facing downwards like so. Pretty easy really. Now time to build some more sub-assemblies. I glue together the 2 halves of these, I am assuming air filter boxes. This is pretty easy, though the result is a bit gappy, but I think a lot of this will end up being hidden. Onto the bottom of these, a round part can be glued. This has some keying to ensure that it goes on the right way. If you put it around the other way, it will sit off center and look quite weird. The next part was a bit frustrating. We need to attach these very tiny little photo-etched brackety things on each side of the box. You can almost see the part here. I use super glue and then very painstakingly put them into the little recesses on the sides of the filter box. Really, the most frustrating part about this is that there is only exactly enough of these parts. It certainly looks like there would be room for some more of them on the fret, but I guess I'm not a photo-etch fret scientist, so what would I know? It would have been nice if they'd included spares though. These are supremely easy to lose. One of them just vanished from my tweezers, never to be seen again. So obviously I ended up with not enough of these brackets, so I made the choice to omit them from the back of the air filter parts, and also one side, where hopefully they wouldn't have been seen anyway. Then I attached these, whatever they are, latchy bits for the air filter. These aren't quite as small and fiddly as the brackety bits I just did, but they are still small and very fiddly. The idea is to try and get the loop part to sit in the bracket part. This took a lot more fiddling than is shown in the video. Thankfully editing is a thing, otherwise we would be here all day. I did eventually get them all into place, or all of the parts that I had anyway. They look okay, but maybe a little bit rough and messy. Oh well. You might be able to tell that I find it a bit annoying that there are no spare parts for these photo-etched bits. The tiny ones are so easy to lose. Did they not foresee that, or do they just expect us to be perfect every time? I move on and assemble this rear cowling thing. This is easy enough. There's some keying to help you get the parts on at 90-degree angles. Then I make some, I guess they're brake lights, or rear convoy lights. Whatever they are, they're easy enough to put together. There's a D-shaped keying to make sure you put them on right. They can then be glued onto the sides of the cowling part I just assembled. There are some tiny bumps and corresponding holes that help you line it up nicely. They do seem to be at an odd angle though. I guess at least they are both on at the same odd angle. Then I add some more details to the Lee's butt, like these brackets. These are just as easy to install as the ones on the front of the tank were. While I leave them set before adding the shackles, I attach the engine bay doors. This is obviously pretty easy. I think I even have the part the right way up. Then I attach the shackles, and obviously, just like the front, these are very easy to put on. This time I didn't even bother using tweezers. And again, I glue them into place because I don't want to lose them. The engine bay door probably wouldn't be very effective without a handle, so I attach that next. This is tiny and the tweezers certainly help with this. Just be careful not to break the part when cleaning it up. After that, I install the air filters. I had left these off until now because I figured they would get in the way of installing the other details. There's keying here in the form of differently sized holes that lock the air filters into place on the hull, though you would have a hard time mounting them upside down anyway. Obviously I'm trying to be careful here to avoid damaging those photo-etched parts I spent way too long fiddling with. Then it's time to cover up some of that with the rear cowling assembly. This didn't fit super well. The side parts don't quite seem wide enough, but maybe I've just done something wrong. There's a little bit of a gap at the rear left corner that I created by forcing the panel forward to meet the hull rear, and it does look a bit messy, but that can be filled in with putty later. At any rate, that's the hull completed. Well, I mean, it doesn't have tracks yet, but it's complete enough. Time to work on the turret. And the first thing we need to do is drill some holes. Are you surprised? These holes are where we attach that third air ventilator that we made ages ago, and it goes into place very easily like so. Pretty hard to mess these up. I then build the tiny turret that goes on top of the regular turret, starting with these, I guess they're vision covers? The right hand one goes on very easily, and so does the left one, but it does require this little cylinder thing to be installed first. This has keying and is easy to get into place. The little armoured flap thing glues over the top of that. I'm not sure why they did this side that way, but it's not like it was hard to do. Next comes this cylinder into which the machine gun will mount. It goes into place very easily. Just make sure that it's rotated around so that the gun mounting hole is facing out of the opening at whatever elevation you want. I add some glue so that it doesn't just fall out, and then I install the hatch. The forward part should overlap the rear part. There's nothing too tricky about this, and it looks quite hatchy. I then add these, I guess they're lifting lugs or something? Whatever they are, they should be on either side of the turret like so. Then it needs a gun. I figured this gun was a bit too small to drill an opening on, but it should look fine anyway. I've given it quite a bit of elevation. I think it's funnier that way. This little turret is now ready to be installed in the main turret, and it fits great, but the main turret still needs a bit of work. So I build the internal gun holdy assembly. I start by adding these trunnion bits. They look messy because I didn't bother cleaning them up. They won't be visible anyway. I also leave them unglued until such a time that I'm sure that they're at the right angle. I do glue what I think is a vision device into place though. This is keyed so that its position should match with the gun's elevation. I then add this. Is it another gun or is it something else? Part of the gun recuperator system? I don't know, but I do know that it goes into place very easily. That assembly can then be glued into the bottom of the turret like so. Now that I know what position the parts I left unglued should be in, I add glue to lock everything into place. Of course, it could be left to elevate and depress, but I usually don't want that option. Just a personal choice. Then I glue this hatch into place. Not really much to say about this, you've already seen me attach a whole bunch of them. Then, after test fitting, I glue the upper and lower halves of the turret together. The fit is very neat, and there's keying at the back of the turret to make sure you get it lined up correctly. Then the mantlet part can go on. Is this called a mantlet? Whatever. What matters is that it goes into place very neatly. That fine gap around the part should be there. I then installed a coaxial machine gun. Like the one on the small turret, this was pretty easy to get into place and I figured it was too small to drill the barrel out, but it should look fine anyway. Just keep your face away from the end of the gun. Probably pretty good advice in general, really. And finally I installed the main gun. Well, the main gun for this turret. It does seem to have 3 guns. This is keyed, though I don't think the keying is really all that important. It's not like there's a muzzle brake that needs to be oriented correctly or anything like that anyway. The gun is very easy to get into place and, unsurprisingly, it looks quite good. I then attach the tiny upper turret. It has tabs to lock it into its mounting ring. Then, with similar locking tabs, I attach both turrets to the hull, almost knocking the antenna off in the process. And with that, the Takom M3 Lee in 1/35th scale is finally complete. And boy did this take a while to build. About 17 hours in fact. Of course, that does include a lot of time spent taking notes and fiddling with the camera, so I'm sure you could build it a lot quicker. Even so, it's still not going to be a quick casual afternoon build for most people. And I would recommend taking your time if you are building this model, or any model really. I think it's preferable to take your time and end up with good results, rather than rush and mess things up. For the most part, I'm very happy with this model. The main thing that disappoints me is the tracks, and the fact that there was only 1 jig for the tracks. More would have been appreciated. The included tracks do actually look very nice, and I'm a bit disappointed that I'm not going to be using them, but they were very frustrating to put together. That's probably largely because of my insistence that I build them such that they would be removable, though they were a bit too short and that's very annoying. Clearly the Frual tracks that I've ordered to replace them haven't arrived yet, but when they do I'll probably do a quick video about them, so keep an eye out for that if you're interested. I also kind of regret having glued the bogies solidly into position. It did help while I was trying to put the tracks together, but now that I'm 100% sure that I'll be using aftermarket tracks which are more flexible, I miss out on posability with the tracks should I want to mount this model on a diorama and have it driving over a log or something. Oh well, I'll live. Probably. My other gripe is with the photo-etched parts. I wish those especially small parts would come with spares. They're just so easy to lose. Maybe that's really more of a me problem than one with the kit. Other than those things, I am very pleased with this kit, and it was definitely worth the big chunk of time that it took to build. I think it looks very nice. I'm sure there are some small details that might not be quite right and would cause a rivet counter's brain to catch fire, but those things are neither apparent to me, nor do they really bother me. I think this is a great representation of a late production M3 Lee. Sure, it might not be the prettiest tank to look at, but it sure is interesting, and this model captures it very well indeed. This kit probably isn't the best for an absolute beginner, mostly because of the sheer number of parts and some of the very fiddly pieces, but I think most people who have built a kit or two wouldn't find it too challenging to put together. The instructions for the most part are easy enough to follow, so you shouldn't be left with too much guesswork. The detailing is very nice, and everything is very neat and crisp. The parts fit together almost perfectly save for a couple of gaps, and most of the rough parts are my own doing really, and not the fault of the kit. There wasn't really a lot of cleanup required, though there was enough, not surprising with all of those parts. Fortunately, almost everything went together very easily with a minimum of fuss and quite a lot of enjoyment. This was a real pleasure to build, except for the couple of frustrating bits. And the result is also a pleasure. All of those rivet heads and bolts and casting texture and stuff look really good. I rather like the little numbers and raised markings all over the tank. I don't know what you would call them, but it's pretty cool that they're there. In my opinion, it adds a lot to the model, and I think they'll look really interesting with a bit of highlighting on them and maybe some dirt gathered around them. I can see a lot of places on this model where that applies, really. I think it's going to be a lot of fun weathering this thing when I do eventually get around to painting it. I'd been told by a few people that Takom's models are great, and this kit certainly didn't disappoint. I think it might be the best 1/35th scale model I've built so far, and I'm definitely willing to spend money on Takom models in the future, even if they do cost a little bit more than this one, which at $60 I think was a good price. If anyone has a specific Takom kit they would recommend, let me know in the comments below. Also, let me know what you think about this kit. Have you built it yourself? Or maybe you've built the Takom Grant, or maybe something else entirely. Put your opinions, ideas, and other comments in the comment section below. Or maybe share some pictures of your own work over on my Discord channel. And if you haven't already, why not sub here on YouTube, follow me on social media, or watch me stream on Twitch. And if you really like what I do, please consider supporting over on Patreon, or perhaps purchasing a shirt or mug from my merch store. Links to all of those things are in the description below. And as always, I shall return soon, so until then, be excellent to each other and thanks for watching. Farewell.